So in the last video, we began talking about the age of reform and the progressive mindset. And we're going to pick up in this video with Theodore Roosevelt, who entered the presidential scene not as president, but actually as vice president to William McKinley, who was assassinated. And so Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency following this assassination. He brought to the presidency solid qualifications, a distinguished war record, credentials as a historian. And although the prospect of Roosevelt in the White House did alarm some conservatives, he tended to move slowly and with restraint. His domestic program did include some measure of control of large corporations, giving more power to the Interstate Commerce Commission, and of course, the conservation of natural resources. So looking at his take on big business. So Roosevelt won a reputation as a trust buster. He did not believe in breaking up big corporations indiscriminately, though. He actually preferred to regulate them instead of breaking them up, because I think he realized the value that they brought to our nation and the many, many jobs they provided. So Roosevelt wasn't really an enemy to all large-scale enterprises, just those that just sort of flagrantly tried to restrain trade. So he faced a Congress that would not really pass strong regulatory laws, and so he resorted to the Sherman Act, which was passed in 1890. And although his Justice Department brought suit against the Northern Securities Company, the president preferred to reach more of like a gentlemanly agreement with these large trusts. This approach did prove successful with U.S. Steel and International Harvester. So with those companies, he was able to reach an agreement. But there was an issue with Standard Oil where they had reneged on one of their previous agreements, and so the Justice Department had to step in and file suit against them. So TR, of course, is known as a trust buster, but in reality, he preferred to regulate big business, not break it up. Okay, so the coal strike of 1902. In this instance, President Roosevelt effectively used the powers and the prestige of his office to intervene in this strike in 1902. And at first, he attempted to try to arbitrate between the management of the United Mine Workers, but it didn't really work out. And so he threatened to seize and operate the mines, which convinced the owners to accept his deal that he was trying to construct. Neither the workers nor the employers were entirely pleased with his deal, but to the American public, the incident really seemed to illustrate the progressive spirit and Roosevelt's, his square deal. The square deal was what Roosevelt came up with. It was a domestic program formed upon three basic ideas. One was conservation of natural resources, the second, control of corporations, and the third was consumer protection. So Roosevelt, he used executive power in this case, and it dramatically extended presidential authority and hence that of the federal government. TR's triumphs. So in 1904, Roosevelt very easily defeated the Democratic candidate Alton B. Parker. And of course, he was encouraged by this victory and aware of the growing militancy of the progressives. And so the president pressed Congress for passage of the Hepburn Act. And the Hepburn Act was passed in 1906. And it gave the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ability or the right to inspect the books of railroad companies and to fix maximum railroad rates. And it also gave them authority over other interstate carriers and prohibited railroads from issuing passes freely. And then when Upton Sinclair's novel came out, The Jungle, which described, the filthy conditions in the meatpacking industry, Roosevelt was able to press Congress to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1907. So as the progressive impulse advanced, Roosevelt really moved with it, and his approach became increasingly liberal, increasingly leftist. And under the conservation category of his Square Deal, he put more than 150 million acres of public lands in federal reserves. He strictly enforced usage laws on federal lands, and he encouraged the state governments to actively regulate public lands. And as he continued to move toward the left, there were many old guard Republicans who turned against him. And the split in the Republican Party was exacerbated by the Panic of 1907. You have conservatives that are blaming him for the panic, and then he responds by moving further toward progressive liberalism, advocating a federal income and inheritance taxes, stricter regulation of interstate corporations, and reforms that were designed to help industrial workers. Roosevelt did make a mistake, though, when he began to criticize the courts, because at that point he pretty much lost all chances of obtaining further reform legislation. So Roosevelt's hand-picked successor was a guy named William Howard Taft, and he served as Roosevelt's Secretary of War, and he was able to garner the support of the old guard Republicans as well as the progressives, and easily defeated William Jennings Bryan, who would later go on to be the prosecutor in the Scopes trial. Although Taft enforced the Sherman Act vigorously, and he signed the Mann-Elkins Act, which expanded the power of the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, so that they could suspend rate increases until shippers had a chance to complain, and established the Commerce Court to speed the settlement of railroad cases. Despite that, Taft made a less aggressive president than Roosevelt had been, and that Roosevelt had hoped Taft would be. For one, Taft weighed over 300 pounds and liked to spend his evenings golfing and eating, and campaigning and speech making pretty much bored him to death. So Taft wasn't really comfortable with Roosevelt's sweeping executive power, or his use of executive power. He was less politically adept than Roosevelt, and pretty much alienated the progressives when he failed to lend full support to a congressional movement that would reform the tariff system. Taft's biggest blunder, though, was when he angered conservationists in 1910 by firing the chief forester of the United States. His name was Gifford Pinchot, and he was trying to protect coal-rich lands in Alaska from Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Bollinger, and it just turned into a big ordeal. And this even led to, or began, a breakup of the Republican Party. And on top of that, the Bollinger-Pinchot affair signaled the beginning of a split between Roosevelt and Taft. Pinchot, who had been fired, was a close friend of Roosevelt. And so the Republican Party split into two factions. And you have, Roosevelt, who was still supported by the progressives, and then Taft, who was still supported by the old guard Republicans. Furthermore, Taft's management of an antitrust action brought against U.S. Steel in 1911 finalized the split. A portion of the suit was directed against the merger of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company with U.S. Steel in 1907, and Roosevelt had personally approved the merger of those two companies, and therefore viewed Taft's action as a personal attack. And so Roosevelt decided in 1912 that he would challenge Taft for the presidential nomination. And Roosevelt carried the bulk of the primaries. Taft controlled the party apparatus and secured the nomination anyway. And so Roosevelt formed a breakaway party, the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, and ran in the general election as a third-party candidate. So that brings us to the election of 1912. And in this election, the Democrats ran Woodrow Wilson, who was the reform governor of New Jersey. And Wilson promised new freedom, that was his campaign, and basically the eradication of special interests and a return to competition. And Roosevelt called for a new nationalism based largely on the regulation of large corporations. Hardcore Republicans still voted for Taft, but the progressive wing went for Roosevelt. And Democrats, both conservative and progressive, voted for Wilson. So even though Wilson did not win a majority of the popular vote, he won a plurality of the popular vote and a large majority in the Electoral College. So he was elected president. So as soon as Woodrow Wilson was elected, he wasted no time in establishing his legislative agenda and successfully steering that agenda through Congress. In 1913, the Underwood Tariff, and I'll put this here. The Underwood Tariff substantially reduced tariffs, and he made up for that by implementing a graduated income tax. And then the Federal Reserve Act finally provided the nation with a centralized banking system. And this was the first time since President Andrew Jackson, had gotten rid of the banking system. On top of that, through Congress, he was able to create a Federal Trade Commission to regulate unfair trade practices. And basically this forbade retailers from handling the products of a firm's competitors and the creation of interlocking directorates, which would control competing companies. But Wilson's decisive management skill and a Democratic majority in Congress really accounted in large part for his successes. He had Congress on his side and therefore could pretty much pass through or legislate just about anything he wanted, within reason, of course. Wilson was a progressive, but that had its limits. He did refuse to support legislation to provide low-interest loans to farmers or to exempt unions from antitrust actions. He also declined to push for a federal law prohibiting child labor and refused to back a constitutional amendment that would grant women the right to vote. So he did have his limits there. Progressives and minority rights. So there was a darker side of progressivism that manifested itself in the area of race relations. And Wilson himself was a reactionary on racial matters, which was fairly typical of progressive attitudes at the time. Only a handful of progressives failed to exhibit prejudice against non-white people. Most progressives assumed that Native Americans were incapable of assimilating into white society. Asians were still subject to intense discrimination, even by progressives. In the South, the progressive era witnessed the institutionalization of Jim Crow laws, which sought to limit black rights in the South. And then many progressive women adopted racial or racist arguments in support of the 19th Amendment. And there were even some Southern progressives who argued for the complete disenfranchisement of blacks to quote-unquote purify the political system. So Booker T. Washington, as the reasonable black rights activist, and his philosophy of accommodation really failed to stem the rising tide of racism, and a growing number of young and well-educated blacks broke away from his leadership and looked instead to black militancy. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first black American to earn a PhD from Harvard, and he called upon blacks to reject Booker T. Washington's accommodationism, and he urged them to take pride in their racial and cultural heritage, and he demanded that blacks take their rightful place in society without waiting for whites to give it to them. And he believed that the environment, not racial factors, caused the problems of poverty and crime. And Du Bois was not really an admirer himself of the ordinary black American. He contended that a talented tenth of blacks would lead the way to their race's success. So in 1905, he and other like-minded blacks founded the Niagara movement. And the Niagara movement didn't really attract mass support, but it did stir white conscience. And as a result, a group comprised mostly of white liberals founded the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909. So the NAACP was completely dedicated to the eradication of racial discrimination from American society. And in fact, the leadership of this group was largely white early on, but Du Bois became a national officer and editor of their journal. More importantly, after the founding of this organization, pretty much every leader in the struggle for racial equality rejected Washington's approach in favor of Du Bois' approach.